And what I'm trying to say now to people is the culture war as you've known it, it's gone. There's exhaustion coming. The breakneck pace of news is so overwhelming. It can't keep going like this. The Trump foreign policy is going to radically change our cultures. But I just think if you're in New Zealand, it's not going to look like 2014 to 2024. This is going to be a whole new ball game. We're going to see the return of national service. I'm just going to predict that. That's happening.
I can see that coming.
And then you think about the church as a pillar. The pillar is stable. I think the stability becomes attractive. I think that embodied thing is going to be really, really key going forward, because you can listen to the best podcasts in the world with the preachers now. You know what I mean? But what you can't get is someone to listen to you.
Graeme and I had the chance to have a conversation with Mark Sayers online a couple weeks ago. And Mark is the lead pastor of Red Church. He's a contributor to the Rebuilders podcast alongside Liddy and Daniel. And he's also an international church thought leader and is helping the church understand our cultural times and trends and how to respond to them. This conversation was incredible. He initially gave us an hour, but we ended up talking for about an hour and 20 minutes. The conversation went places I didn't think or expect, and we were all a lot more candid and upfront about what we were thinking about the future and the trends moving over the next couple of years in this ever-changing world that we're living in. If you're new to Lunch on the Way, welcome. Basically, this podcast is all about helping people engage with meaningful conversations. Our conversations are open-ended. We interview some people. We just have some dialogue between myself, Graeme, and Jonathan. And we've been doing that for a while now. And so there are 3 episodes that you should check out if you enjoyed this one. The first one is episode number 32, Real Christianity, John Mark Comer's Critique of Church and the New Martyrdom. Episode 47, The Endlessly Toxic Pursuit of More, Adjusting Our Assumptions of Church. And my personal favorite, which inspired my PhD research, is episode 39, Metaphors Are Reality Shaping Our Best Conversation Yet. I hope you enjoy today's episode with Mark Sayers. Kia ora koutou, welcome to Lunch on the Way. I'm Joey, joined by Graeme, and this lunch hour, 10:30 Melbourne time, 12:30 Auckland, New Zealand time, we have Mark Sayers with us today. How you doing, Mark?
Yeah, I'm doing really well. Yeah, great to be here.
So Fridays sound like podcast Fridays to you?
Not always, yeah, but yeah, had a couple today. So we did our podcast on Wednesday, so it's been a little bit of a podcast week.
And with this conversation, I'm going to make a few assumptions just off the bat. I'm going to assume if anyone clicks on this conversation, they would have already listened to a bunch of stuff that you and the team put out at Rebuilders. They're familiar with your work and some of the thoughts you've had. I know you published one just the other day, and I'm like, I need to quickly listen to this so I don't ask the same question twice. So that's just going to be my working assumption. But Graeme and I are just going to go back and forth, and we're just going to see what happens and see what type of conversation emerges from it. And I know you don't really know us that well, which is crazy. And we're going to have hopefully a conversation. So there's going to be a level of trust going on here and kind of see what happens. But I want to bring things back 5 years to start, if that's okay. Because I don't know for you, I'm a pastor out in East Auckland, originally Canadian. And here in 2018, my wife's from East Auckland, and I work part-time at Laidlaw College alongside Graeme. And COVID was one of those like watershed moments for me that I'm still truly wrestling through. And I had a meeting probably 4 months after that initial global lockdown with a bunch of other pastors in the area. And we had one prominent pastor show up and give a talk about the things they've been learning through this COVID season that we thought was going to come to an end, but was really just beginning. And he mentioned a lot of good things that were just resonating with the group, like, oh, we need to rethink ministry. We need to rethink how we do what we do. And then someone dared to ask the question, so what is your church going to change? And understandably so, he couldn't answer the question because one, it was too fresh. But even now, 5 years on, I'm noticing that not a whole lot has actually changed. Like all these reflections that we've had over the past few years, I don't see necessarily implemented. It's almost like we've put this COVID moment to the side, and we're like, now we're kind of back to normal life, which is the exact opposite of what your podcast, Rebuilders, even talks about. Like we can't just put it to the side what we learned. So what I would love to ask you to start off with is, I guess within your ministry philosophy, what have you really taken home as like a home truth
Mm,
for your ministry setting? And what were you learning through COVID that you're like, yeah,
mm,
we can't stay the same. Like this has
yeah.
to.
That's a great question. I think for us, there was an element of, I mean, I haven't seen the stats for Australia or New Zealand. I know that in the US, I think about 30% of people didn't come back. I think it's probably something similar in Australia and New Zealand, just anecdotally. And, um, the kind of person who came back was different than what I expected. Um, and so I think that there was people who uh, you thought would come back didn't, and then really unlikely people who were on the fringe of church or even without faith who then were at the center, if that makes sense. So I think like almost first off, I remember there was just people flying around ideas like church is now going to be smaller or it's going to be more digital or it's going to be in homes and so on. Maybe there was a big move early on, or a lot of people were sending me stuff like the house. This is going to be the birth of the house church, or not the birth, that's going to be the main thing. But then very quickly in Australia, or particularly here in Melbourne, you couldn't meet with people in house. There was a stage where we could meet in our auditorium with 2 meter spacing with like 30 or 40 people, but you couldn't meet with five in your home. So there was this constant changing dynamic. And I think that did perhaps, we were like, what's the next, form of church? But in so many different environments, things were moving really rapidly. But I think looking back, what changed for us is a realization that organization to a certain level would only get you so far. So I'll explain it like this, that I think there's been this thing where you're dysfunctional and then you get to a point of functionality, but then you can just keep on going to the point where you're trying to get industry standard world's best. And I feel like, we were on this journey to here, but I realized that going past that functional bit is not going to bring the kingdom of God in power. So we got to this desperation point. So for us, it wasn't just COVID. My sense is in Australia, New Zealand, there was then a lot of stuff like I know my friends in the US had a lot of political stuff. Weirdly, even in Melbourne, which was in 2 year lockdown, we didn't have that much political stuff. Like the polarization thing wasn't as present, and maybe that's where we are positioned closer to the city or whatever. I'm not sure, but then you saw a lot of conflict. So, like in talking to pastors in actually Australia, New Zealand, Canada, a lot of personal pain. Like a lot of the emails we get at Rebuilders are people who just went through staff team breakdowns, board breakdowns and stuff like that. So we experienced sort of some of that as well. So I feel like where we are today, there is this depth of discipleship and a simplification of what we're seeking. I think that's the change that we made. So there was almost a humbling. So I must put it this way. When it first happened, we were like, okay, so what's the thing we're going to learn? What's the new model? I feel almost most of the lessons I learned were internal. And I think our people were internal. And I look at my church now, and look, our church was, went through COVID. We, like many churches, went through some different, conflict stuff. A lot of people left because, there was one point where literally New Zealand had no COVID, the whole of Australia had no COVID, and we were living in this, zero lockdown thing. But Melbourne had COVID, like Metro Melbourne. So that was really tough. Went from that to some stuff, and then literally we come out of some of the conflict stuff, and then we're straight into, my wife got diagnosed with cancer. So it was just like this brutal 2 to 3 year season. But I look at my church now, and there's a simplicity, a hunger of spirit that to me is more worthy than any great model we could have come up with. Like I would not want to go through any of that again. So I think it's not so much a model, it's a spirituality or a depth or something that God has given us. So yeah, that's my sort of off the top of my head reflections.
Just while you're on that one, I mean, you mentioned, I mean, I just to sort of help get myself into the zone and get into your head a
Mm,
little bit. I watched Rebuilders last night, and by the way, the
mm.
video's a nice little change, isn't it? Quite cool.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Yes.
You mentioned, and I mean that you were kind of reflecting on the politics, and boy, there's a lot we could talk
Mm,
about there. But you
mm.
just mentioned, how's this going to affect the church, and you used the word um, proceduralism,
Yes.
which caught my attention because I wonder if this is related. That the sense of people are, well, my feeling is people are kind of a bit over it. Oh, I've got to do another. You know, when you organise something, there's health and safety, it's all these sort of things. And I wonder whether that's related in the sense that people are kind of over it. And I
Yes.
wonder whether also around that, and I'll be interested in your comment to that, the notion of being embodied in a space.
Yes.
Like I mean, for myself, I couldn't look online. I was so sick of a screen. I just thought I
Mm,
can't look at church online. I just don't even want
mm,
to. I don't even want to go there. Um,
mm.
but I wonder, is that sitting in that mix? Any comments
Yeah.
on?
Yeah. So I think there's two issues there, like going after them both. I think the first one, embodied, what we noticed in Melbourne was it happens year one, like our online viewership just goes crazy. You know, we've got people emailing us, oh, we're in California, we're going to be part of your church. And we're like, what does that even mean? You know, year two, by the end, Melburnians were just utterly sick of Zoom because you've been on Zoom for 2 years, you're on it all day, you're talking to your friends on Zoom, and then on Sunday, you don't want to go onto another video thing, you know. So we noticed it really dropped off. And we made a decision, unlike most of the other churches around us, we're not even going to live stream our services anymore. Like we just stopped. I could see my team were exhausted, and I thought the need in my city now is actually face to face ministry. And we noticed that now. We did because again, because of some of the lockdown stuff, you couldn't do small groups, but you could do like groups of three, meet in a park or a cafe or something outside. So we then went from small groups, which are 10 to 12, to three. We're noticing now this, and for a while coming out, people were almost introverted more, even extroverts became introverted for a while. They were just not used to being around larger groups. So the huddles, groups of three, continue for some time. What we're now seeing now is a return to we want to be in a group of 12. We want to be in people's homes. We want to be in the service with people. There's just this real return to being in person. And I think the embodiedness of that is really key. Um, I mean, we can talk about politics and where I think it's going to go because I think there's some big changes for Australia and New Zealand coming down the pipeline. But you know, I think that there's exhaustion coming. The breakneck pace of news is so overwhelming; it can't keep going like this.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to see a return.
When you said last night, I mean,
Mm.
just the last couple of days or the last week, I mean, it's just like one thing after another. It just keeps rolling in.
It makes you want to
And
throw your
it's
phone out the window.
and it's a drama. I mean, literally, I don't know when this is going up, but I just looked on. I had this quick break between these two podcasts, and I just turned on X, and Elon Musk's former wife, the mother of his child, Grimes, the Canadian electronic musician, just put a message on Twitter like something to the effect of, "Elon, you're ignoring me. Your child's having a medical emergency. Can you please call or just hire someone to deal with this?" You know, and you watch it. Look at it's so disorientating watching. So not only you're watching like America's going to take over the Gaza Strip, but then you're also watching almost like a insane part at times soap opera, part at times science fiction novel. It's utterly disorientating. And I think you're going to see a return of localism in a way where we're just like, I cannot deal with this. I was saying to my wife the other day, we used to have a local newspaper just for this part of Melbourne. It went the way of the dinosaur with digital. And we were just saying that day, we almost miss it. Almost just rather pick up the newspaper and go, oh, what's happening with the local pool?
Yeah.
What's happening over there? And I think you're going to see that. And in Melbourne, you have seen some of the city, like certain parts of the city, which used to be a lot more where there were clubs and different things struggling, but then other areas which are quite suburbs flourishing because people don't want to drive 30 minutes to a coffee shop. They just want to walk down the street. So I think that embodied thing is going to be really, really key going forward. And I think you're seeing that. I mean, even Tom Rayner, the American Church Growth guy, said that, and this was before COVID. I remember hearing this. I think he did a podcast in 2019 saying American megachurches are shrinking their auditoriums down to like 300 people.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that there's something around scalability of size because they're just overwhelmed by the world. And the good news, I think, there is the churches can do this. You know what I mean? Like yeah, there's some mega churches, but there's not been many mega churches, I think, planted in Australia. I mean, maybe you guys can tell me if I'm wrong on New Zealand, but there's, like I said, there was a bunch which sort of kicked off 80s, 90s, early 2000s. It's a lot harder to build one from scratch now. And so I think, the church is going to be at that sort of scale, embodied community, because you can listen to the best podcasts in the world with the preachers now. You know what I mean? Like, but what you can't get is someone to listen to you. You know, someone to sit with. So yeah, so that's the embodied thing. The proceduralism thing. So going, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that note, because I just picked up the thing and I saw it this morning. It was one of your old previous prime ministers, not he wasn't there long in the Conservative Liberal, but he was railing
Turnbull?
against Turnbull. He was railing against the Americans. We can't trust them. And as you're saying about localism, it kind of spins off there. This sort of wider cultural sort of move to think, actually, we can't trust the US, and it localizes. We can only trust what's in front of us. We can only trust what actually we can touch, we can put our hands on physically, because actually we can't trust that out there anymore. So I don't know. You think there's a connection there?
Well, I mean, globalization's unraveling. So there's still going to be globalization. We're talking on this platform in two different countries. So that's going to continue. But, I even find it's easier for me to talk in New Zealand than, there's always been the cultural links, but there's a sense that I think the issues that we're dealing with are more similar because of this localism thing. And I think I'll talk about proceduralism in a second, because I think that's very relevant to where we are. But I think, you're looking at re-onshoring of industry. You're looking at, in a more competitive world that's going to break up into blocks, that's what's going to happen. We're going to see the return of national service. I'm just going to predict that. That's happening.
I can see that going.
You're going to see these experiences where previously 6 years ago, the young adult might be more connected to their friends globally or on platforms. That's still going to happen. But I think that the move around the world is we're going to have to make more stuff where we are. We're going to have to be more self-protective as countries. We have to define ourselves as countries. Canada, fascinating what's happening with the US. There's been on some calls to Canadian leaders where, the hockey, I think, is on today or something or whatever. And there's
1 hour.
1 hour, yeah. There's a Canadians almost embarrassed. I saw this great video of, it was like maybe like under 12s, under 13s hockey team of Canadians who'd gone to, this was like last week or something, gone to play a game in America, and the Americans refused to play the Canadian national anthem. And the Canadians stood up, these parents, and sort of awkwardly sung the national anthem. And there's this great bit where one of the Canadian guys stood down and goes, "Oh, who would have thought this?" Because Canadians aren't, sort of define themselves against that sort of American style patriotism. But I thought, wow, that's something new, like having to go, what does it really mean to be an Australian or New Zealand? Not in the sense of how we defined it up till now because there'd be almost this bit where you'd hear Trudeau speak or Jacinta Ardern or, like Anthony Albanese, and like, what's Australia? Australia is an inclusive place and they say all these words, and I'm like, they're all saying the same words. There's nothing in there which says anything distinctive, So you're going to see all that. So I think there's a local level localism of that, and then there'll be a national version of that, and maybe even sort of province statewide or whatever, regional as well. So yeah. I'll comment on proceduralism because I think this is something I can talk to you guys about, perhaps more than I can speak on some American podcasts. I think that it's really interesting. Proceduralism is something which has grown up without us really realizing, and you could also call this bureaucratization, the sort of rise of human relations. And what's happened is that I'll put it this way: there's a book by Nate Silver, the American data scientist, called "On the Edge of Everything." I've got it here somewhere. I took it to the office, but On the Edge. Yeah, I've literally got it here. On the Edge: the art of risking everything. And he just has this brilliant analogy, which I heard, and I was like, "This is so true." He says there's two visions now of society. One is a vision of, imagine, I think he calls it the village and the river. The village is the risk-averse procedural capital. This is where the HR manuals are. These are the people who are the bureaucrats. They could be denominational bureaucrats. They could be local government bureaucrats. They could be the HR department of a corporate office. And there's a lawyerly barrister element about this. This is where, the manuals are. This is what we need to do. And their goal is to make everything safe. Then you've got this emergent force, which is, Silicon Valley, crypto, Elon Musk trying to get to Mars. This is the entrepreneur trying to start a new business. And he calls that the river because it's sort of like dynamic and moving. Now, the village is built upon the risk taking of earlier generations, if that makes sense. You know, America built a railway across the United States and a lot of guys died. A lot of Chinese immigrant workers and Irish immigrant workers died building. They've now been trying to build a railway from San Francisco to LA, which makes total sense, two massive cities. Why would you not have a fast railway between those two? And it's just taking years and years and billions of dollars. Why? Because of proceduralism, you know. And, you know, we've seen this in the church. So I wonder, as a coping mechanism. So I'm going to do some nuance here because a lot of people are saying, isn't proceduralism good? But I wonder at times as a coping mechanism in secularism, because for a while we've been in decline, churches, harder to plant churches, harder for people to come to faith. We want to sort of professionalize. Like, I think it was, I don't know if it was John Piper or Eugene Peterson. I think maybe they both made similar comments that in secularism, the minister can fall into other jobs, like they become the therapist or they become the sort of political activist or something. And I wonder if something that's happened where we've become proceduralists, you know, and is there a good thing to proceduralism? 100%. In my state, in Victoria here, we had a royal commission into historic abuse in the Catholic Church, and that introduced a lot of proceduralism. But it's really interesting in the UK, and again, John, I totally understand all the nuances in this. You know, they had a recent thing where Justin Welby stood down, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and some other bishops stood down because of their knowledge of some figures who'd been involved in abuse in the past. And John Milbank, the theologian, made a comment on Twitter, and he just sort of said, all of this safeguarding that we've done, and he made some comment, I'm paraphrasing, where, you know, the local granny at the local Anglican church has to do all this training. We did all of this and none of it stopped this at the highest level. So there's almost this thing in proceduralism where what you do is you push the risk onto the people. So instead of like us changing things, we'll give you all these things you need to do to allay risk. So is this I love Australia and New Zealand because they're safe places. They, you know, like there's an element I really like being here rather than in a country where it's super dangerous, or I know that if I'm going to buy something, there's safety standards. There actually is like I remember on the glass on my parents' car when I was a kid had Australian New Zealand safety standard literally written on the glass, little sticker. I love that. But I do wonder whether in the church, if someone was going to plant a really risky, dangerous church in a tough area, could we do it? And I had this moment where we and I have to be careful what I say. We have as a church have sent someone as a missionary to a highly secure, you know, there's security issues. We can't say where they are. And we were doing this. And at the same time, we'd just been through a sort of safe churches seminar, as we call it here. And again, too, I'm not having a go at those people or anything. But I sort of felt like this feels like there's some contradiction in the midst of this. You know what I mean? Like the more procedures that we have, the ability as cultures, Australia and New Zealand are going to fall behind in the global competition of great power competitions, the more proceduralism we have. And so what you see is what you don't want is sort of then Elon Musk and Javier Milei with their chainsaw coming in and slashing everything and just blowing up USAID without any, you know, like reform. So I'm more of a conservative in the pure sense of I want to see institutions reformed, not revolutionarily destroyed. You know, I don't want to go and shoot the Tsar in the Winter Palace. But I do sort of waving a little bit of a flag that I do think that our hyper-professionalism of proceduralism may actually soon start to blunt the mission of the church if we're not careful. That's my sort of thinking behind that.
I think that's exactly right. And I think what's underneath all of that is actually the metaphors by which we understand reality. Where when you say procedure, what comes to my mind is, like cause and effect mechanism, tweak this, do that, make sure the system is purposefully delineated so that we get this preferred outcome. And that is in contrast even to what you've articulated that your church learned through COVID, which is we need to actually reduce proceduralism. We need to actually increase the spontaneity of the Spirit and God calling people to do risky things. And so I truly think it's the metaphors underneath everything that kind of change that reality. And how does that happen? How do you change the metaphors that you might not even be conscious of?
You know?
Godspeed.
Mm, mm,
Pray. But I do think it's that, and I want to maybe shift then to what I think is one of the most powerful metaphors that you gave when you were at the Abide conference last year. And it was what was the cathedral we were in? Was it St.
St.
Mary's?
Mary's, yes, St. Mary's.
Mm. Yeah,
I counted up. I don't know, eight, nine pillars each side. Anyway,
yeah.
carry
mm,
on,
Yeah,
Joey.
and so
But
you're talking about, and hence the book that's coming out, and you talked about it, I
mm,
think it's sermons back in 2022 or something, about going from platforms to pillars.
yeah.
And I'm sure you can articulate that a lot more. But what the obvious connection to me was, yeah, for the individual to be a pillar
Mm,
in your church, in your society, that makes a lot of sense to me. But
mm,
but it's one thing for it to be on the individual level, but what does it look like for a church to
mm,
be a pillar?
yes.
Because this is where like the implications of that are actually quite dangerous.
Mm,
And that's where the procedure doesn't make sense because I take it. I try not to get political. I kind of
mm,
quite adverse to being political because I had this understanding of Christianity and politics not really working well together. But at the
mm,
same time, it there's like this call to action moment
mm,
in our time right now, and there's so many different not culture groups, institutions like the ARC conference that just happened in the UK,
yes.
and
Yes.
they're talking about how they need to do stuff, recreate society, or reform it in a way that makes sense.
Mm,
Then you have guys like Vance going to Paris and then going to
mm,
Germany and being
mm,
like, we're going to let AI rip. We're just going to let it go.
yes.
And I'm like,
Yes.
all right. But I think your pillars metaphor is so important because it kind of
Mm,
grounds who we should be in this moment a whole lot more.
mm,
Not necessarily to an
mm,
individual level, which it clearly applies, but also to an ecclesiological church level.
mm,
So maybe
mm,
could you just explain that difference a little bit and
yeah.
also maybe just even just externally process what could that
Yeah.
mean for the church, less the
Yeah.
individual?
Great question. Yeah. So, I mean, my basic thesis is I began to realize that we're moving from a culture which has been shaped by institutions, Australia, New Zealand, a lot of, British institutions, but then there are other institutions as well. And, that really created the reality that, we're part of. But there's this new reality, which is a revolutionary reality, really, which is digital platforms. And digital platforms are a very different type of business. Just to give you one example, Kodak, were in New York State, and they were in a town. I've forgotten the town, and Rockford, maybe it was. Yeah,
Rochester. Yeah.
yeah, yes. And they would be there, 30,000 people, which then meant there's school teachers to get employed, there's local stores, there's a men's fashion store and a hardware store, all this sort of ecosystem created by this company. You can see this in a city like Birmingham where the Cadbury factory was, and they did that in this really sort of interesting way and created life. And you compare that to Instagram. Instagram, apparently at one of its heights early on before it got sold to Meta, employed 12 people, you know, and had some programmers, and this multi-billion-dollar entity doesn't have this trickle-down effect into the culture. So it's extractive. There's something about digital platforms which is extractive. So I saw that was radically changing society, and it was offering a kind of intensified individualism where the answer was, in a sense, there's less mediating institutions in the world. So to help people understand that, you've got the individual, then you've got the large meta institutions like the state or the Catholic Church or the Commonwealth or Blackstone, asset managers. But then you had these mediating institutions, that could be the local bowls club or a trade union or the Italian Association of Melbourne. And people were part of these face-to-face entities. And Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone, where he said American life had changed because those mediating institutions had disappeared. Alexis de Tocqueville said in his book Democracy in America that one of the strengths of America as he traveled around in the 19th century was these mediating institutions where people could, it was like a sort of step in between. They gave meaning. They were an alternate political system to the state. But what's happened is they've been wiped out. And there's a number of reasons about economics, individualism, and so on. So what digital platforms are trying to do is give individuals a place in that, a replacement mechanism, and that's social media platforms. That's, you don't need to have a taxi company. You can just get an Uber. You connect to the big company. You don't need to go and make friends at the local bocce club and drink espressos. You can just get online and be with friends with anyone in the world through Facebook. And that created this kind of individualism, which was like about getting a platform where your content can be heard and seen, and you can be affirmed as an individual not because of the content of your character, but by you being seen, your voice, you being seen. And a platform is ultimately an architectural structure. It's a stage. So if we can just elevate the individual almost with a form of celebrity, but it's a democratization of celebrity. And so all of a sudden, Mr. Beast, the YouTuber, is one of the biggest entities in the world. It's just some guy who started doing crazy stuff online. And this has radically changed the world. It's changed the leadership and influence, because now young leaders are not going, okay, how do I work my way to the top? I want to have influence. So I'm going to serve in a Baptist church in New Zealand, and then maybe one day I'll have a large Baptist church and it'll take me 30 years, or I'll be the head of the Baptist Union of New Zealand or whatever and have a voice. You don't need to do that anymore. You just need to get some content out there, have a camera and, do some crazy things, or say some controversial things. So it's radically changed how we influence. And the counterpoint to that is the idea of a pillar. That I noticed that I had this moment where, in Australia, New Zealand, we sort of have land acknowledgements and so on. So we have, welcome to country. In Australia, when you land in the plane and you land in, certain cities, they'll acknowledge, the local Indigenous nation. And they'll also say, pay respects to elders, past, present, emerging. And I thought, hang on, why is it in Australia we're acknowledging the cultural role of Indigenous elders in passing on Aboriginal culture? And we're like, that's really important, because otherwise it's going to be lost. Yet at the same time, operational in the culture is this youth-obsessed platform culture which destroys the idea of eldership. It's as if you're old, you've got no wisdom, you've got nothing to say. We don't need a mechanism to pass it on. And I remember just was literally taxing on the tarmac when this dawned on me, and just going, this is bizarre, these two contradictory things. Like, all cultures should have elders. Almost all cultures have valued that idea that you're standing on the shoulders of giants. Edmund Burke said, traditions passed down through the generations. It's wisdom passed through the generations. It's sort of a cross-generational institution. So I thought, well, when someone who's an elder passes away, they often describe them as a pillar of the community. I thought, that's fascinating. Now, I can't go, I'm going to be a pillar of the community tomorrow. I have to have that earned. To be an Aboriginal elder in Australia, there's a process of formation. You can be rejected as an elder if your conduct doesn't align with your eldership. I thought that's true across all cultures. And previously, leaders would be looked to because, over a long period of time, they've shown faithfulness to God, they've shown character. Their content yes, they produce content, but it's not disembodied from their character. Platforms mean you can have content and you can be an absolute turnip in your private life. And, it doesn't matter because they're just watching the viral video. And biblically, there's some rich metaphors. Jesus is creating a living temple in the world. The scriptures talk about us being pillars in the living temple to come at the end of the age. And so pillars are supportive. They work together. Like, platforms about me being platformed or my brand. Pillars work together. They create space for others to flourish, but ultimately for the presence of God to dwell amongst us. So that's the sort of basic concept of platforms to pillars. But I love your question too around what is it to be a pillar as a church?
Yeah.
And I think, so to dig into that, one thing I think people need to get their heads around, and like one message I've been saying lately is there's a lot of, between 2014 and I would say 2024, there was this massive adjustment in the world. And it was an adjustment politically. The traditional parties we had changed. Identity politics became a huge part, woke, if you want to call it that. And very much centre-left parties jumped onto that. Some Christians jumped onto that. It became part of the culture. So there was a lot of people who've still been adjusting, whether they're yay or nay on it, adjusting to that reality, jumped on board, fighting it. And then really what happened in 2024 is that just went out the window with the election of Donald Trump for a second term. And the entire American populace swung towards Donald Trump, shockingly, but not just in the United States. Justin Trudeau who embodied this no longer, was basically resigned. Jacinda Ardern embodied this internationally. There was a backlash. Our centre-left Prime Minister got in after a long period of Conservative rule and was radically unpopular within 6 months. And there's a number of reasons for that: inflation, cost of living, an exhaustion. And what I'm trying to say now to people is the culture war as you've known it, and there's a lot of people who have now built brands around this, anti or for, it's gone. Like, it's going to go real quickly, and you may be hearing this in New Zealand going, oh yeah, but hang on, I just went to this thing and my local government's doing this. It's just going to trickle down from the US, Already McKinsey Australia, the consultants just in the Australian Financial Review the other day said, they're going to get rid of all their diversity, equity, inclusion stuff in Australia. There's one reason that's happening, because the corporate headquarters in New York have gotten rid of it. So what's going to happen is corporate office in Auckland is going to go to the big conference in New York or Washington or LA and go, oh, they're not doing this anymore. The algorithms, the whole of Silicon Valley has shifted across to the Trumpian right. Like you saw the inauguration, they're all there front row. They've all switched their algorithms away from these issues now. And then politically, it's just seen as toxic across the world. So centre-left, I just was watching a video this morning by sort of a leading left-wing thinker in the UK, and she's like, guys, we've got to stop doing this. Yep, keep going against racism, keep going for the poor, keep going against sexism, but the tactics we've used have just backfired on us massively. So what that means is things are going to change very quickly. And all of a sudden, I said this to some people yesterday, the issue you may be dealing with in 5 years is not an issue around sexuality in your church. I'm not saying that's going to go away, but the red button issue might be in 5 years or 4 years in your church is, does your parishioner get a neural link chip where their brain is no longer distinguishable from AI? Like in Canada, look at the assisted dying bill and the effect that that's had on the country. In the UK, what we're going to see is these issues around technocracy is really where we're going. The blurring between human and machine is the next front of ethical choices. Mm. So what you're going to see is you're going to see things at breakneck speed happen. One thing I'd predict too is we may see, because of the disgruntledness of the young, a return of classic left-wing economic politics. And you may see an economic revolution happen. I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen, but I think if there's brewing, you saw Luigi Mangione assassinate the head of a healthcare fund in New York City, and he's become an absolute folk hero amongst the young. The majority of Gen Z think his actions were justified. At some point, they move into political power. And so what we're going to see is this breakneck speed. I'll just say this and then I'll stop. There was 2 intelligence reports that were given by the Australian counter-extremism sort of expert, Czar guy, and then one in the UK. And what they said is everything's changed around radical ideology. What they're finding now is, in the past, war or terror, there might be someone who is like an Islamic extremist, and they can pick these radical little mosques and where they're going online, and they can track them. What's happening now is people are, I'm a radical extremist, Islamic extremist. 6 months later, I'm a white supremacist. 6 months later, I'm a nihilistic environmental anarchist. There is actually new stuff. I won't go into it now. There's new ideologies that it would take me an hour to explain to people, which are already resulting in deaths. There's like now radical trans militants, and people are spinning between these ideologies. And what the police forces are saying on counter extremism is the new thing is ideological flexibility and rapid change. Mm. So I predict that we're going to live through multiple revolutions of ideologies that could be coming in every 2, 3, 5, 10 years. And then you think about the church as a pillar. And the pillar is stable. You can go to Greece now and there's ancient pillars still standing there, and I think the stability becomes attractive. Yeah. And speaks through, just real quickly, one story and then I'll shut up. In Australia, we just had this very prominent rapper come to faith, 360. And he announced it on this interview with Channel 10 interviewer, and they were shocked. You don't talk about this on Australian TV. And they were shocked, and they asked him about it, and he said, we had a mate, interestingly blanked out the mate's name, which I thought was fascinating, like beeped it out. And he said he came to faith and we saw the difference in his life. We were so anti-religious, but we saw the difference in his life, and his life has changed. He's a completely different person. And I was like, there's something in that. That's the mission of the church going forward. Stability, character of content, being in place for a long time, being embodied. And I think that that's going to be increasingly luminous as, I think, in many ways, cultural darkness appears in many places.
Yeah, and along with that, one thing, when everything is just chaotic and changing and rapid and you're looking for stability, the one thing I always come back to is our fascination, Graham and I, and that's the other guy, Jonathan, who's on the podcast, is with ancient traditions and of Christianity. And when my family goes up north a couple hours to holiday, and it's over the weekend, I make it a point to bring my little daughter to the little small Anglican parish. And mostly because it harkens back to a not just nostalgia, it's not that, but it's like an embodied, simplified version of Christianity that just resonates deeply with my being in the face of this techno-utopian vision of the world and this constant change in news feed and what's on X, which I now don't have social media on my phone because it's just not helpful anymore. And our friend Jonathan is fascinated with Eastern Orthodoxy. Yeah, he has a Pentecostal background, but attends an Anglican church now in Auckland. And he wouldn't mind me mentioning, just he went to an Orthodox church, Greek Orthodox church a few months ago, and the service was 3 hours long. They stood for the majority of it. And he's like, I wouldn't subject this to my kids because they would be bored out of their mind. But he said there was something so beautiful. It was like you were tapping into a reality for a moment that that was more real than what you were living now. And that was almost like a retreat and a refresh and a rest from the craziness of the world. And it's not to say that we should be retreating from the world, because that's one ecclesiological, missiological kind of reaction to what's going on, which I don't think is appropriate. But it's almost like within COVID, I kind of concluded paradoxically that, oh, the Sunday service isn't enough for discipleship. And then we come into COVID and I'm like, oh my goodness, Sunday morning is so massively important. And it is what you just said. It is that rest, that stability, that constancy. I don't want to be relevant anymore. I genuinely have no appetite to be relevant as a church. And I'm from an evangelical Wesleyan tradition.
Yes.
Yeah. What are your intuitions about that?
Can I just throw something in there? Because I'm interested to know that, just on that back of that. And I can't remember, Mark, whether you said it or whether it was a reflection when we were in St. Mary's Church in, what was it, October, was it? Yeah, when you were speaking. And you talked about the pillars and platforms. And I looked around and I looked at these pillars in St. Mary's. I think there were 8 or 9 up each side. So that's 20 pillars. And then I looked at the ceiling, I looked at the floor, and I thought about the separation of the ceiling and the floor. Now, I don't know whether you talked about it, but it crossed my mind of this notion of a space, of actual space. And I'm interested to read your book. I mean, have you thought about that sense in which that the pillars create the space? And I wonder within the space, because people are looking for a sense of transcendence and immanence. And I wonder whether that is something that you think about.
Yes, totally. So I think the analogy I said, without pillars, the roof would be crushing us now. Like, we can be in this room because the pillars have lifted up the roof and created space. So to bounce those two off, and this is me like signaling the nuances we're going to need to have. The new culture war is going to be 2 temptations. The techno-utopian thing is actually all about immanence. It's actually a replay.
Collapses everything, isn't it?
Yeah, and it replays Gnosticism. So, you've literally got now, and it's crazy. Like, you talk about some of this stuff. All the UFO guys, all the tech, like the Silicon Valley guys, you listen to Joe Rogan, they talk about UAPs, UFOs. And no longer is the conversation about UFOs like, oh, Uncle Joe the farmer saw a craft land in his backyard. They're literally now going to the classic old New Age Esalen retreat center in Big Sur in California. And there's these meetings of intelligence agents, shamans, mystics, Silicon Valley guys, and they're summoning psychically UFOs. I was literally looking at video of this morning. This is the big thing. And there's members of Congress doing this. And I read that, and it's no longer about, it's almost like there was this period in the Renaissance where there was this blurring of the early science. Isaac Newton, people like this were talking about physics, but then he's off doing alchemy and mysticism, and we're returning back to there. So literally, like, words that some of these Silicon Valley guys use is like they're modern magi, and magi as in magic, And so there's this blurring of almost Gnosticism. We've got to escape from here, go to Mars. There was a movement in the Soviet Union called Cosmism, which Peter Thiel, who's behind so much of this stuff, Elon Musk, they're all into this. So very mystical, technological, upload your consciousness into the internet. They're all doing ayahuasca, microdosing, mushrooms, talking about spiritual entities. There is a slight rumor going around that, some of these people in the Trump administration are going to have a press conference at some stage in the future. There's reporters saying this, where they may say the US government has evidence that there are spiritual entities. We thought they were aliens, but they're demonic angelic beings. It's the language they're using. Like, I'm reading this going, this is wild. So that's all hyper transcendent. Transcend from your bodies, go to the spiritual realm, mushrooms, AI, technology, UFOs, whatever. That's that big. And your average, and this is what we've got to also get our heads around in the church, maybe people listening. Your average person is not reading the New Zealand Herald or watching, in Australia, my parents love the government news at 7 p.m. On the ABC. They read the Age newspaper. They're very well informed, and I love them. And I read that stuff too. But I'm trying to say to them, like, the average person, the average adult now in Australia and New Zealand is listening to Joe Rogan. They're listening to episodes about politics, but then the next one's on ancient civilizations by Graham Hancock that have been, missing. And then the next one's on the demonic entities I met on my ayahuasca trip. And here's why, there's nanobots in your thing. Like, that's where people are at. So transcendence, right? So I think we get that. Upload your consciousness to the AI. This is Musk, Thiel, Vance. Vance worked for Peter Thiel. He's a Silicon Valley guy. Silicon Valley have won the White House. That's where it's going to Mars. The other side is a reaction. So I'm 100% with you. There's something of just visiting cities and going to churches that have been there for over 100 years. You go to Europe, it's amazing. Go to Ireland, and, we stayed, Trudy, my wife's parents migrated to Australia from Ireland, and, we stayed where they used to go on holidays as kids. And there's like this, the world's first 24-hour prayer and this monastic cell, like incredible in the dark ages, like amazing. There is a temptation that I'm just going to outline. So in contrast, that's the transcendent, the immanent. Now, what happened in just before World War II in the 1930s, and I've been studying this, I've studied it before, but I'm just reading and reading and reading, 70s, 1930s, is Germany reacted against the technological industrial revolution of Britain and France. And it went into an incredibly occult moment. Like, I just read a book from Yale University by Eric Kurlander on just the influence of the occult and spiritual in the 1930s in Germany. Amazing. And they had border sciences, which is very much what we're seeing now. This border sciences was things like dowsing. It was the Steiner movement. And it was like, it's a bit scientific, but it's not, like a lot of stuff we would see as New Age, you can trace it back to the 1930s in Germany. And so there was this reaction against transcendence and technology to bring it back to earth. And the two things were blood and soil. And so Herder, the philosopher, had actually sort of developed this, way of understanding was to have a nation. So they saw the cities, they're filled with English people and Jews, and it's this cosmopolitan financial elite is the language they use. So we've got to find the real German, the real Lithuanian, the real Pole. And how do you do that? Well, it's us who've got the blood, and we own this soil. This is ours. And so you saw this massive romantic reaction against this. And going back to first, Catholicism, Lutheranism, and stuff like this, but then even deeper into paganism. And so there is this thing happening online where there is this backlash. And again, none of this is, I'm not having a go at Eastern Orthodoxy or whatever, but speaking to some people in those words in Catholic worlds, the problem they're now having is young men coming in who it's a political project for them, who are quite far right. And so there's a large link between this stuff. And I think it's Matthew Rose has written an interesting book on the post-liberal right. I think it's Matthew Rose. I'm trying to see if I've got it here somewhere. But, he's saying that we also have to be aware that this is a shift. So in Trumpism, you've got two wings. You've got your sort of Steve Bannon, blood and soil almost, and then you got your Silicon Valley transcendence. So there's this element that people will move in that direction, which is healthy, and it's a corrective to sort of your platformed, perhaps culturally relevant, seeking Pentecostal Australian New Zealand vibe. But there's a danger that it's going to move into blood and soil sort of ethnic nationalism in different forms. So I'm just sort of waving that, which is transcendence. It's the transcendent. So the space that we then open up is the balance, which is at the heart of theology. You know, Grenz and Olson did that great book on 20th century theology, and it comes down to it's always between the balance between transcendence and immanence. And, you know, I think holding the space with that paradox, almost the paradoxology of those two things held together is going to be really key. But it's a creative tension. That means you seem to be against that. It's not centrism and boiling down, but it's you seem to be against these two things.
Yeah. And one, I know we're almost coming up to the hour, so I just have one last comment. One thing I realized about myself is I became politically conscious, I would say, in 2015 when I was 22 years old. I just got married and I was out of my bubble of a Bible college, and I'm like, what is going on in the world? I'm like, what just happened? And I, to be completely self-disclosing, because the culture was predominantly left-leaning, I found myself leaning more center-right. And I thought that's what I am. Okay, sure. And then lo and behold, the election of Donald Trump the second time and the shift in cultural power from one side to the other has actually made me realize I might be more centrist than I thought. I might be balancing, towing the line a whole lot more because I'm like, well, what about compassion and empathy and caring for the lost? And I'm like, yeah, freedom of speech and all that stuff is great. So you're talking about transcendence and immanence, trying to keep that balance, but then there's also the left and the right trying to keep that balance. And I think one of the biggest temptations for anybody within church and even churches themselves is to see themselves as a pillar leaning towards one of those polarities, leaning hard in that direction. And it's so tough. It is so tough to find that balance in the middle. Do you feel that tension? Do you feel that temptation to swing and like you got to check yourself sometimes?
Well, what I found is, you know, the what was conservatism in 2004 is not conservatism now. You can go not that far back and find videos of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama speaking against gay marriage. Penny Wong, who's our foreign minister, who is in a gay marriage, you can find videos of her speaking against gay marriage because that was not the political platform of the Labor Party in Australia. People change very quickly. And what we're seeing is left and right have completely changed. There's actually like tariffs that Trump's about to do. That's a left-wing thing, you know. The White Australia policy was created by the Labor Party. It was created by the left to protect workers from foreign workforces. So politics is always spinning and always changing. And what we think of the left and right is much more fluid. But I mean, it's funny. My daughter said to me the other day, if you weren't going to write a Christian book, what would you write? And I sort of thought about that. And I thought, if I was going to write a book, I'd call it The Radical Swing Voter. I don't know if you use that term in New Zealand, but, you know, I think there's something where in Australia, we don't like all politicians. So we've got a cynicism to all politicians. And there's something radical where it's almost like, well, okay, guys, you've got this platform, prove it in real time, you know, and if you pull it off, I may vote for you again, but I'm not, you don't own me. So if I was going to do a political book, it would become not a centrist, because I think there's a danger with centrism and how it's been communicated that there was a bit where they had, you know, like, when Trump was first elected and, you know, George Bush and Obama, you know, buddies. And, you know, there is an element where this reaction is against the decisions of the Iraq war, you know, which was this war to promote freedom and democracy. I think a lot of what's happened, we're seeing the US, is because they entered into a war where hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed. You know, many soldiers went over, militarized the culture and so on. The 2008 global financial crisis was also some of the decisions that were made by, you know, Barack Obama. Oh, you know, he came in at the end of it, but you go back to Bill Clinton and so on. So centrism was actually extremely radical in its own way, you know. And so I think that I like the Australian healthy cynicism towards political projects. I think that's actually good. But it's only then, because the average Aussie, I don't believe in anything, mate. But I'm cynical for that because my hope is in Christ. Now, that doesn't mean I'm apolitical. I want to be politically engaged, but I think there's a healthy cynicism and a swing voter where I'm not going to sign over to you guys, prove something. So yeah, so US aid is the classic example. Donald Trump cut US aid, but it's complex. So on one hand, that means people in Sudan don't get a bag of grain that they desperately need. We also see that the US did use US aid to influence elections and stuff like this. The joke on the left for a long time was that US aid was an extension of the CIA in overtoppling left-wing regimes in South America. We also find that a lot of the culture war issues, and possibly in my country and your country, which we think are organic to our countries, particularly around identity politics and sexuality and stuff, what we're finding as people go through the documents is so much of that was sponsored by NGOs that were sponsored from Washington. So, is getting rid of US aid good or bad? I think it's extremely nuanced. So my answer is be cynical towards political projects. And also the answers are very nuanced. And left and right is sometimes an excuse to not think.
I know that Joey wants to. We need to close this off.
I'm happy to go for a few more moments if you want to finish a few thoughts.
Because my mind is spinning with this and thinking about the church and your comments, those words of embodiment. And I heard last night, which is something that I've, certainly thinking about because of having done quite a lot of research in communication and digital culture and all of that stuff, was the notion of what does it mean to be human. And I think I was sort of thinking in this in-between space, the church as the embodied place that holds that together. And what does that look like? So there's questions of what does it mean to be human, to be truly human? That's a really great question for the church because, as I say, I think people do separate being Christian and being human. I don't think you can, but we have. But I guess thinking about how does the church hold that? What are those practical expressions of the transcendence and immanence? I think it's possibly a really interesting question.
And I think I just finished Nick Spencer's book Magisteria. It's over there, which is on his history of science and religion. It's fantastic, and he's the director of Theos think tank in London. And at the beginning of the book, he talks about that really science is around sort of questions of what is it to be human, who has power, how do we know something, And so I think where we're going with artificial intelligence, with hybrids of human, even, I think even the ability to end life early, this sort of stuff. These questions are going to go from interesting discussions in ethics classes in theological seminaries to frontline pastoral issues. And, I think more and more people are going to ask that question. What is it to be human? I don't know if you've had the experience of talking to ChatGPT. It's unerring, you can use the thing. I tried it the other day and I'm just having this chat. And there was actually something really sort of that threw me. Long story. I recently was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and I must have looked up something about what foods were good to eat with rheumatoid arthritis. And I was asking another question in this conversation, just trying it out about food and beef or something like that. And it was like, oh, hey, Mark, maybe this is happening because you're rheumatoid arthritis. And I just was like, I remembered that from weeks ago. And that felt like a friend asking me that. Not a friend, I didn't feel warm, but I'm like, how do you know that about me? And I think in this little thing, as I've been writing different things, it's building a profile of me, and what happens when, we are 2 years away from people in your church, maybe 3 years from people in your churches having humanoid robots walking around. When we're in New Zealand, we were in the Sky Tower and they've got a really bad droid, rocking around, sort of laugh at it. But, it's Tesla's working on this. There's Chinese ones working on it. You may rock up at church one day and the usher is a humanoid robot. This is happening. There was the pastor in the US, I've forgotten his name, who's done a pastoral AI of himself. So you can sit and have a conversation with him. So everyone can get to the celebrity pastor. So all these questions, at the center of them is what it is to be human. I think these questions are fundamental. I've also got a little bit more time, but I'm also happy. I think for New Zealand and Australia, I think, and feel free to ask questions, but I think the Trump foreign policy is going to radically change our cultures. And I think people have not got their heads around it. So what I was thinking I was going to talk to you guys, I thought I would bring this up. Just this is my sort of like, hey guys, get ready. My dad's actually said something really interesting to me. He said, Trump won. He goes, I realized it was internal chaos. We're all looking back going, oh, how's this going to go? And, watching stories about Trump sacking people in his cabinet. And then Dad said, I'm realizing this is about external chaos and change. And I don't know if I did it this time. I've done this before in New Zealand, where I don't know if I did it at Abide, where one of my favorite questions is, and I do this, I've done this in other places, that, you ask, what's New Zealand culture like? And people will have a chat and we're like this and it's peaceful and, blah, blah, blah. And then ask the question, if New Zealand was geographically between Iran, Iraq, and Syria, what would New Zealand culture be like? Well, everyone would be in the army, and you wouldn't be an inclusive culture in the way that you think that you are now. And you'd be a much more militaristic culture and so on. And politics would be completely different. And so there's an element that what Australia and New Zealand think of ourselves is so determined by history up until this point, a geographic location, America's umbrella that we're flourished under. And I know New Zealand's defined itself against American security stuff at times, but the reality is the reason that there's been shipping lanes in the Pacific that you can get your TV from China is because of the US Navy. And all of that's going to change. Tariffs, our countries could enter into deep, deep recessions in an America first world. And even, you look at the political style of Jacinta Ardern. Another question I would ask, would Jacinta Ardern have existed if America had never existed? Probably. I don't think she would.
No.
Because we copy as much as we go, we're different and we're not like them. And one thing that I just noted too is one difference that's happening that's worth knowing. I went to America this time in October, and one thing that really surprised me was I was in Ubers and I was chatting to people. I'm always doing my research, chatting to just average Americans. Average Americans know about Melbourne's lockdown. Average Americans know about Jacinta Ardern in New Zealand. They know what the haka is. They've seen memes and all of this, and they have opinions on this stuff. 10 years ago, they barely knew where we were. And what also that means is that online, J.D. Vance is online, and Marco Rubio is online. And one thing they're really angry about is Anglosphere countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Great Britain, the Republic of Ireland, looking at America going, you guys are dysfunctional. Look at your gun violence and your lack of healthcare. And I've literally seen people in Trump world now attacking, saying, you guys have got healthcare because we're subsidizing your medicine. And so I think that a real possibility is that this Trump and again, too, it's not about Trump, it's about an entire cadre of thinkers that are now controlling all the different branches of American power, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, who feel that we in the rest of the Anglosphere deserve a bit of a kicking. And Canada is experiencing that powerfully now. This is unthinkable. I've got to be careful what I say. I've said to a couple of Canadian friend leaders, you need to start preparing. Like if you're in the church, you need to start having some background questions of what if your country is broken up. Like, I'm not saying that's the definite thing, but Trudeau on a hot mic was caught saying to people, and I don't think it was a hot mic. I think I'm cynical. I think if you're going to drop that truth in Canadian public, you don't want to make a press conference. Steve Bannon is saying it's not about tariffs. It's about the Northwest Passage or the North Passage above Canada is going to, with global warming.
100%.
We could be in a world where, New Zealand, Australia are very isolated, and what does it even mean? For New Zealand, which has been able to define itself, and Australian relationships in a sense, we're a bit different to you guys, but what if we need a security alliance here, because we're in a very dangerous world with China, which sees the South China Sea as its territory and cutting off sea lanes. All this to say, what's Mark saying here, people might be asking, is I think that the culture of our countries are going to radically change. And what we've known up till now has been enabled because of what's going on in the global superpower. That's about to change. And it's not just waited out for 4 years. This is a permanent change now. That has huge implications. So I thought it's worth saying that, because I do feel like part of what I'm talking to Canadian podcasts or that I'm interested in not just American politics, but what this plays out in the UK or whatever. But I just think if you're in New Zealand, it's not going to look like 2014 to 2024. This is going to be a whole new ball game. I'll tell you now, America is very concerned about Chinese influence in New Zealand. I've listened to, I'm podcast nerd. I've listened to American security podcasts. They bring up New Zealand and they start laughing about how they feel that it's compromised. That's part of the reason why Canada is being bullied at the moment, So all of this stuff's going to have a tremendous effect on our politics. The Australian election is going to get announced any moment now. And all the things is Elon Musk going to start chucking stuff at us? He's throwing things at the German election, which is this weekend. This is a very, very different world.
You've heard about Cook Islands, haven't you, Mark?
Yes. I mean, I saw there was the op-ed, I think it was in the New Zealand Herald, of should we invade the Cook Islands? I've been to the Cook Islands. It'd be pretty a lovely place. Would not be hard to. But this is the new reality. The Jacinta Ardern era, and this is not a go, this is me as an outsider looking at New Zealand, that you'd have an op-ed and people may have laughed at it, but this is the new reality. The new reality could be New Zealand having to move a security envelope over certain places, or Trump going, unless you guys do this, you're going to get a 40% tariff on stuff. This is the new world is less about identity politics, ideology, what's the woke agenda in the new Marvel movie. It's about armies, pipelines, power plays. And it's a completely different land. Yeah, that Cook Islands is a great example of what the new world we're heading into, and in multicultural churches as well. I mean, I live in an area where I remember there was a couple of years ago, there was basically hand-to-hand combat in which people were being killed in the north of India. And there was real talk that India and China could go to war. And I remember thinking, what does that mean for churches around here that have got Indian and Chinese populations, a large amount of their churches, because we've got large populations here. So the future culture war might not be between woke and conservative. It could be also between, migrant populations in your church whose countries just went to war. And how do you balance that? And so all that to say, not to cause alarm, but I just think in 4 years, the stuff we're going to be talking about is not what we were talking about 4 years ago, or even literally 7 months ago.
For sure. And we have a hockey game in about 30 minutes, which I'm going to watch, and it's going to happen. But I'm being in New Zealand, and I'm just trying to stay conscious always of what's happening where I'm from in Canada. They are framing this, media in Canada is framing this as the 72 summit series between Canada and Russia, which is culturally one of the most significant political games ever played in Canada. And it has that feel. And I always want to go back to, that metaphor, pillars. What does it mean to be a pillar when everybody is just so angry and everybody is just so imminently focused on the here and the now? And not that the here and the now doesn't matter. It certainly does. But what does it mean to see further down the field, see beyond that, and see how that impacts how you live in the world? We have a few rapid fire questions really quick. Just some
Can
fun.
I just add one point on that? Sorry, just real quick. Sorry, I don't know. I said I had now, but I'm the one pushing at the time, and we'll get you to your hockey game. But the other thing that we may look at, which may be surprising, and Canada is the prime example of this. Some of the critique of Justin Trudeau was that it's a post-nationalist state, and we need to look at our history of colonization, et cetera, et cetera. In days, you're now turning to, as in Montreal, I think they were just belting out the national anthem, which is significant. It's being in Quebec. And you're seeing in Canada the rise of nationalism, not defined by, hey, we need to be nationalists here, but America's after us. I think Australia, New Zealand, we could see the same, where it's less I don't care, and even the Commonwealth thing, to be honest, there's something in me, I don't know what it's like, it's in New Zealand, where if Canada's getting beaten up, they're like, oh, so hang on, we're in the Commonwealth, and all these discussions about, the historical colonization. There's still these links that are really interesting that I think the rise of nationalism in response to an America First policy is something we may need to be aware of. And I said to some of the Canadians, what happens if all of a sudden people in your church are like, why are we asking that American speaker out? Why are you recommending him? Because what you may see as well is American speakers jumping on that side of that as well. This is all speculation, but just to help us think. That's what I was thinking. So return of nationalism.
We may see Kennock emerge again. You know what that is, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah. We could all be fellow citizens there. I come back in 5 years and we've all got the same passport or something.
When I heard Turnbull just this morning, I thought, it does push the Anzac spirit together. Because we kind of think, well, if Australia sort of loses confidence in the US, it ties the two countries closer together. Because
100%.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Let's go for it. We're going to end on a lighter note. Okay, this is like 2 minutes here. Graeme, let's go back and forth. I'll start with question one. You got the question?
Oh yeah. Okay, hang on. Let me just get myself my questions here. Away you go, Joey.
All right. Question one. You know how the US banned TikTok? Which app on your phone do you wish the Australian government would ban for you?
Oh, that's a great one. Uber.
Yeah.
Okay, what podcast do you listen to?
My favorite podcast is These Times with Helen Thompson, who is one of my sort of heroes of thought, historian at Cambridge University. Tom Matei, that's my number one go-to.
And what book have you recently read that has kind of blown your mind a little bit, other than the Bible, obviously?
Yeah. So I am reading a book called No Fear at the moment, which is about the New Deal with Franklin Dwight Roosevelt. I just read also Magisteria by Nicholas Spence, I mentioned before. I'm reading also, I'm giving you three here. I've got, multiple things at once. I'm reading, multiple people told me over the years to read it, but I'm finally reading The Master and the Emissary by Ian McGilchrist.
Yeah. Right. That's
fascinating book. So they're three good ones.
We're reading right now, Graeme and I, The Matter with Things by McGilchrist. It is blowing my mind. It is
interesting.
Excellent to read.
2-volume job. It's the door-stopping books too.
Yes, they're huge. And implications fascinating. And this is part of, I think, this spiritual, just rethinking of enlightenment that's going on. Fascinating. Anyway.
So what's your favorite country to visit and why? That's not loaded, by the way. So,
you don't have to say Canada or New Zealand.
Yeah, or you have to say New Zealand, but.
I always love visiting New Zealand. Canada is beautiful. One of the countries, because I think also with ministry, so much of my experience is you're going to places and you're doing ministry. And I did do ministry there, but in Japan, I loved visiting. That was fantastic. Been to Tokyo twice. Have not been for years. I would love to go back again. So that's wonderful. Denmark, I'm going back there soon as well. Copenhagen's beautiful.
What's your go-to pastry when you're with the gang?
Almond pastry.
Nice.
Okay, what's your go-to meal or dish to eat?
Biryani, lamb biryani.
And final question, just to kind of end it on a nice note. What's the passage of scripture you just always come back to time and time again?
It does change. I don't have one. I do feel that there's different seasons. Even if you think a lot about Mark 6 and the contrast between Jesus coming home, prophet in his own town, and then him sending out the disciples. And I wonder, and I think this is applicable for New Zealand, the tall poppy syndrome, I think there's a little bit of a tall poppy syndrome element in Mark's gospel there with Jesus, and just reflect on that a lot. And in my own ministry, being sent out in the authority of Christ, contrasting with the prophet in your own home, that's something that I've been coming back to the last little while.
Well, thanks, Mark, so much for the time. You got to let us know when you come to Auckland at some point, if it happens again soon, and we'll love to meet up if it's at another conference or whatever.
Oh, thanks so much. I've enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, really lovely having you doing it. And thank you again for the space. There's so much we could talk about, but time doesn't allow us to go. We could go in a few other places, but we just appreciate the space that you've given us. So thank you. And maybe down the track a little bit further, or maybe in 18 months' time, we can pick you up again and have a another kind of chat about where things are up.
Yeah, after Canada's becoming
I'm sure there won't be any. Yes, exactly. There won't be a shortage of things to talk about. I guess. Yeah.
So good.